It was supposed to be a routine stop, but for Officer Marcus Jennings, the night was about to take an unexpected turn. What began with a traffic violation quickly spiraled into a shocking confrontation that would leave the officer questioning everything he thought he knew about justice, race, and redemption. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. We have a new special story for you tomorrow. Officer Marcus Jennings had seen his fair share of uneventful evenings patrolling the quiet streets of a small, mostly calm town. On this particular evening, the sky was a brilliant shade of orange as the sun began to set behind the trees, casting long shadows across the pavement. The road ahead seemed almost too calm, except for one thing. As Marcus rolled through a neighborhood known for its peaceful charm, he noticed a lone car driving through, weaving slightly between the lines. The driver was a black teenager, likely no older than 17 or 18, and Marcus's instincts kicked in. Something about the kid's slow speed and the way the car seemed to drift made Marcus suspicious, and in his line of work, suspicion was often enough to justify action. Marcus flicked on his sirens, his car's blue lights flashing in the stillness. The teenager pulled over without hesitation, but Marcus's sharp eyes took in the teenager's nervousness. He was clearly trying to act calm, but couldn't quite hide the anxiety. Marcus approached the vehicle, his boots tapping softly against the pavement as he made his way to the driver's side window. "Evening," Marcus said coolly, his voice flat as he looked down at the teenager whose name he didn't yet know. "License and registration." The young man, Darren Jacobs, hesitated for a moment, then reached into the glove compartment, fumbling with the paperwork. Marcus could already tell that the kid was intimidated. He wasn't sure if it was just the uniform or something more, but either way, it didn't sit right with him. "Everything okay, son?" Marcus asked, eyeing Darren closely. The teenager didn't meet his gaze immediately, but answered politely, "Yeah, officer, just headed home from a study session." Marcus raised an eyebrow, noting the teenager's hesitance. Something about this didn't sit right with him, even though it was a simple traffic stop. Maybe it was the nervous sweat on the young man's brow, or maybe it was the fact that he had seen too many similar situations where things got out of hand. Whatever it was, Marcus's gut told him there was more to this encounter than met the eye. He wanted to press further, but the teenager seemed harmless enough. "Step out of the car, please," Marcus ordered, his voice firm but not unkind. Darren, now visibly nervous, did as instructed. As soon as his feet hit the pavement, Marcus immediately felt a slight discomfort in his own posture. Something wasn't right about the situation. Darren was just a kid. Why did he feel so on edge? He took a step back to give Darren some space as he searched his own instincts for an explanation. Just as he was about to ask Darren another question, Marcus was interrupted by the roar of motorcycles. A group of 5 bikers, their engines growling like a pack of wild animals, pulled into the parking lot of a nearby gas station. They laughed loudly as they dismounted, clearly looking for trouble. Marcus's attention flickered between Darren and the bikers for a split second. The tension in the air was palpable, and Marcus could feel himself becoming more aware of his surroundings. He couldn't quite place it, but something was off. Suddenly, one of the bikers yelled out to Darren, making a crude comment about him being on the wrong side of town. The words were harsh, venomous even, and Marcus's protective instincts flared. But Darren said nothing. He kept his head down, not responding to the taunt, but Marcus saw his hands tremble slightly as he fumbled with his jacket. "Stay here," Marcus ordered, his voice low as he moved toward the bikers. He had dealt with rowdy motorcyclists before, rude, loud, and often willing to escalate things for no reason. As he approached them, one of the bikers, a large man with a thick beard, turned his attention to Marcus. "You got a problem with us, officer?" the biker said with a sneer, his voice dripping with disdain. "I don't have a problem with you. Just keep it down and mind your business," Marcus replied, trying to keep things civil. He could already feel the tension between them rising. The situation was escalating faster than he had anticipated, but the biker wasn't having it. "Look at this guy," he laughed, looking back at his friends. "Thinks he can tell us what to do. What's your problem, officer? You think you're better than us?" Marcus's jaw tightened, his patience wearing thin. He had dealt with this kind of disrespect before, but there was something about this group of bikers that made him uneasy. Maybe it was the sheer aggression they were radiating, or the way they seemed to surround him, as if daring him to make a move. "Listen, I'm just trying to keep the peace here," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm not looking for trouble, but if you don't back off, we're going to have a problem." As Marcus spoke, he could see Darren out of the corner of his eye, standing by his car and looking down at the ground. The last thing he wanted was for this situation to escalate further, but the bikers were not backing down. They were egging him on, daring him to make the first move. Just then, Marcus caught a flash of movement in the distance. Another car had pulled into the parking lot. He turned to look, but before he could get a clear view, one of the bikers shoved him hard in the chest. The shove caught Marcus off guard, knocking him back a few steps. This was it. This wasn't just a confrontation. This was turning into a full-blown altercation. The bikers weren't just picking a fight with him. They were picking a fight with the law, with authority itself. "All right then," Marcus muttered under his breath, his body tensing as the adrenaline began to surge through his veins. This was no longer just about pulling over a teenager. It was about defending himself and restoring order. As Marcus stood there, his fists clenched in anger and his heart pounding, he could feel the weight of the situation intensifying. The bikers were now visibly closing in on him, and his instinct was to defend himself, but he knew better than to escalate things further. He was a trained officer. He couldn't afford to make rash decisions. His eyes flickered back to Darren, who was still standing by his car, trying to remain calm but clearly shaken. The bikers were laughing now, egging him on, but Marcus held his ground. His hand hovered near his belt, ready to reach for his radio if things got out of control. But before he could make a move, he heard a familiar sound. Another set of tires crunching on gravel. A black SUV pulled into the gas station parking lot, its headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. Marcus turned quickly, wondering if it was just another passerby, but his heart sank as the door opened and a tall, composed figure stepped out. It was none other than Chief Thomas Williams, the new chief of police, Darren's father. Marcus froze. He hadn't expected this. He had known the chief was scheduled to oversee a department meeting tonight, but seeing him here, of all places, in the midst of what was about to become a volatile situation, made his stomach turn. The chief was known for his no-nonsense approach to law enforcement and his strong stance against racial injustice. If he saw this altercation unfold, Marcus knew it would be much more than a simple reprimand. Chief Williams walked toward the group of bikers with calm authority, his eyes scanning the situation. The bikers, still laughing and joking, stopped as soon as they saw him. The tension in the air thickened. Marcus stood still, unsure of what to expect next. "Is there a problem here, officer?" Chief Williams asked, his voice steady but commanding. Marcus took a deep breath and looked back at Darren, whose face had gone pale. He could see the hurt in the young man's eyes, the discomfort of being harassed and targeted for no reason other than the color of his skin. Marcus had seen this behavior too many times before, but never so close to home. This time it was someone he should be protecting, someone who had been wronged. "Chief," Marcus began, swallowing hard, "these men were making threats toward this young man. I asked them to move along, but they wouldn't listen. Things were escalating and—" "Enough," Chief Williams interrupted, turning to the bikers with a cold, piercing stare. "You will leave now. I won't ask again." The bikers exchanged glances, clearly not expecting the authority of the chief to be behind the command. Razor, the leader, sneered, taking a few steps forward, but when he locked eyes with Chief Williams, he hesitated. There was something in the chief's gaze that made him stop. "You don't want to make this worse for yourselves," Chief Williams continued, his voice growing colder. "I suggest you leave now." Razor, though clearly unwilling to back down, understood the authority in the chief's voice. He motioned to his crew, and one by one they climbed back onto their bikes, muttering curses under their breath. With a final look at Darren, Razor revved his engine and sped off, his crew following suit. The sound of their motorcycles faded into the distance, but the air still hummed with tension. Marcus exhaled a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He turned to face the chief, but Chief Williams was already walking toward his son, Darren. The moment of intensity between them felt like an eternity. But when Chief Williams reached his son, he placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You all right, son?" Chief Williams asked, his voice softer now. Darren nodded, but his body still trembled from the experience. "Yeah, Dad," Darren said, his voice quiet. "I'm okay, just a little shaken." Marcus stood off to the side, his mind racing. The truth was, he had been wrong. His gut had told him to make the stop, but he hadn't considered the full picture. He hadn't taken into account the racism, the prejudice that people like Darren had to face every day. His eyes briefly locked with the chief's, and he could see the disappointment there. But it wasn't anger. Not yet. It was a look that spoke volumes. "You're Officer Jennings," Chief Williams said, his voice low but sharp. "You didn't escalate things too much, but the way you handled this, it needs work. You've got to do better. This man, this boy, is someone's son, and he deserves respect." Marcus nodded, feeling his face flush with shame. He had been too quick to judge, too quick to assume. It had clouded his judgment, and it had put Darren in harm's way. "Chief," Marcus said, his voice steady but apologetic, "I made a mistake. I see that now. I'm sorry." The chief looked at him for a moment before nodding slowly. "Apology accepted, Officer Jennings. But you have to understand that this is bigger than one person. It's about every person, every day. It's about understanding where people come from and what they go through." Darren, hearing his father's words, took a deep breath and gave Marcus a nod of his own. "It's all right, officer," Darren said quietly. "I know you didn't mean to hurt me. I just don't get why people treat me this way. I was just trying to go home." Marcus stood in silence, absorbing the weight of Darren's words. He couldn't help but feel the sting of guilt. How many others had Darren encountered who treated him with the same disdain, the same judgment, simply because of the color of his skin? How many times had he been wronged for no reason other than his race? Chief Williams turned his attention back to his son. "Come on, Darren, let's get you home," he said gently. As they walked toward the SUV, Chief Williams looked back at Marcus. "Take care of yourself, Jennings, and remember, every person deserves to be treated with respect." With that, the chief and his son drove off, leaving Marcus standing there, feeling both humbled and unsettled. He had learned a powerful lesson in those few moments, one he would carry with him for the rest of his career. The incident at the gas station had revealed more than just the prejudice that Darren had to face. It had exposed Marcus's own biases, his own assumptions. But he wasn't going to ignore it. He would do better. He had to. The next day, Marcus couldn't shake the weight of the previous night's events. His mind replayed the moment over and over. How quickly he had jumped to conclusions, how wrongly he had treated Darren, and how much better he could have handled the situation. But what troubled him most was how little he understood the reality of what Darren and others like him faced every single day. He had seen the blatant disrespect that Darren endured, but now, with a clearer perspective, he began to realize how much of that was rooted in a systemic issue. Marcus had expected to move on with business as usual, but instead his world was about to be turned upside down. He had just finished his morning briefing when his phone buzzed, displaying the name of his commanding officer, Captain Linda Harris. With a sigh, he answered the call. "Officer Jennings," Captain Harris said, her voice strained. "We've received a formal complaint about the incident last night. The bikers you dealt with, they filed a report." Marcus's stomach sank. He had anticipated some sort of fallout, but a formal complaint? That could mean serious trouble for his career. "What's the complaint?" Marcus asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "They're claiming you used excessive force, that you attacked them without provocation. They're accusing you of being the aggressor," Captain Harris explained. "The report says you were confrontational and initiated the conflict." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. His first instinct was to deny it, to protest that he had been the one trying to de-escalate, but the reality of the situation hit him. The bikers had already spun their own version of events. They had lied, and now it was his word against theirs. "Captain, that's not what happened," Marcus said, his voice tight. "I was trying to protect that kid. Those bikers were threatening him. I only stepped in to defuse the situation." "I believe you, Marcus," Captain Harris said, her tone softening. "But we've got to follow protocol. There's an investigation underway. You're going to need to be prepared for some tough questions, and you need to keep your head clear." Marcus rubbed his temples, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had been a part of the force for over 10 years. He knew how these things worked. This could lead to disciplinary action, maybe even termination. The last thing he wanted was to lose his job, especially over something he knew wasn't his fault. "Understood, Captain. I'll cooperate fully," he replied. "I'll give them my side of the story. I just need the chance to explain." Captain Harris let out a deep sigh. "We'll make sure everything gets sorted out, but right now we need to focus on gathering evidence. I'm sending a team to review the security footage from the gas station. I'll also need to interview you later today. Prepare yourself for some difficult questions." As Marcus ended the call, he couldn't help but think about Darren. He had seen the look in his eyes last night, the fear, the uncertainty, the frustration. How many times had Darren been wronged like this? How many other black people had faced the same kind of systemic bias day after day? Hours later, Marcus found himself sitting in the department's interview room. The familiar white walls, the fluorescent lights, the sterile atmosphere, it all felt too much like an interrogation. He wasn't used to being on this side of the table. He had been called in to tell his side of the story, but already he could tell this wasn't going to be a simple procedure. His commanding officer, Captain Harris, sat across from him, her gaze steady as she went through the details. Marcus couldn't meet her eyes. He knew the disappointment would be there. The evidence was stacked against him, despite his best intentions. He had followed protocol, or so he thought, but now it seemed like everything he had done would be scrutinized. "Officer Jennings," Captain Harris began, her voice serious, "I need you to go through the events of last night again. Take me through everything." Marcus took a deep breath and began recounting the events, starting with his initial traffic stop of Darren. He spoke about the harassment from the bikers, how they had mocked Darren and made crude comments, and how he had tried to de-escalate the situation. He told them how the bikers had taunted him, pushing him to the edge of his patience. But when he got to the part where Darren's father, Chief Williams, arrived on the scene, Marcus paused. It was a turning point in the story, one that felt heavier than all the others. He had faced the bikers, yes, but when he looked back at Darren and saw the pain in his eyes, he knew what he was fighting for. Captain Harris didn't interrupt as Marcus finished telling his story. She gave him a long moment to sit in silence before speaking again. "You're not the first officer to be accused of misconduct, Jennings," she said, her voice low. "And unfortunately, you won't be the last. The problem is these things don't always get sorted out the way they should. But in your case, the security footage from the gas station is clear. The bikers started the confrontation. We've interviewed witnesses, and their statements line up with your version of events." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. This was the moment he had been waiting for, proof that he had been in the right. He wasn't going to lose his job, his career over a lie. But he knew there was more to the story than just this one incident. The bigger issue, the one he had been blind to, was what Darren had faced every day. "Captain," Marcus said slowly, his voice quieter than before, "I need to make something clear. The bikers, they didn't just attack me. They attacked Darren. They treated him like he was less than human. I saw it last night, and I was wrong because I didn't fully understand what he had been going through." Captain Harris didn't say anything at first. She just stared at him as if processing the weight of what he had just said. Finally, she nodded. "I'll make sure this all comes to light," she said. "But you need to remember this, Jennings. This is bigger than you. This is about making sure people like Darren don't face this kind of hatred, this kind of bias, just because of the color of their skin." The days following the investigation felt like an endless blur of interviews, paperwork, and intense conversations. Marcus knew the truth, and he was certain the security footage and witness statements would clear him of any wrongdoing. But the true impact of the situation wasn't just about his career. It was about Darren and the long-lasting consequences of the systemic prejudice that Darren had faced all his life. Marcus was sitting at his desk when the call came through. Captain Harris informed him that the investigation had concluded and the results were in. Marcus, you've been cleared of any wrongdoing. The security footage and the witness statements confirmed your side of the story. The bikers lied, and you acted within your authority, she said, her tone firm, but there was a softness there now. You did what you had to do to protect that kid. Marcus leaned back in his chair, a heavy sigh escaping his lips. The relief was almost immediate, but it was also bittersweet. This wasn't just about him. It was about the bigger picture, the injustice that Darren had experienced. The truth wasn't just about proving he had done the right thing. It was about understanding how many people just like Darren were facing these kinds of situations every day. Thank you, Captain, Marcus replied quietly. But I think there's something more here that needs to be addressed. Captain Harris was silent for a moment. What do you mean? I can't just let this go, Marcus said, his voice steady. I need to do more for Darren, for everyone who's been treated like this. We need to talk about this openly. We need to address these issues head-on, not just for me, but for everyone else who's been discriminated against. There was a pause on the other end of the line. You're right, Captain Harris said finally. But what are you thinking, Marcus? I don't know yet, he replied, his voice full of resolve. But I've got to start something somewhere. Weeks went by, and the town slowly began to return to normal after the incident. But for Marcus, it had been a wake-up call. He couldn't ignore what had happened, not just in the parking lot, but in his own heart. He couldn't ignore the bias he had held, the assumptions he had made. It had taken Darren's bravery, his father's leadership, and the investigation to open his eyes. Marcus had always thought of himself as a fair and just officer, someone who followed the rules, but he realized now that it wasn't enough just to follow the rules. Real justice came from understanding, from being able to look beyond what was on the surface and seeing people for who they truly were. It came from empathy, and it came from fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Chief Williams, who had been a constant presence throughout the investigation, called Marcus one afternoon to meet in his office. When Marcus arrived, Darren was sitting in the chair next to his father's desk. He looked up as Marcus entered, and for the first time, Marcus saw the young man without the fear and uncertainty that had clouded his eyes the night of the confrontation. There was something different in Darren's gaze now, something that said, "I'm not afraid." "Marcus," Chief Williams said, his voice calm but direct, "I've been talking with Darren and we both agree that something needs to change. We need to help others understand what happened here. It's time for a shift, a real conversation." Marcus nodded slowly. "I agree," he said. "I've been thinking a lot about this, about how we can make a difference. It can't just end with me being cleared. We have to take this opportunity to make a change. Teach people, not just police officers, but everyone in this community, what real justice and empathy look like." Darren, who had been quiet up until now, spoke up. "I know it's not easy," he said, his voice steady, "but I've seen my dad fight for justice his whole life. He's taught me that one person can make a difference. But it takes courage. We can't just stay silent. We have to speak out." Marcus looked at Darren and Chief Williams, both of whom had been through so much. Darren, the young man who had faced prejudice every day of his life, and Chief Williams, who had fought for a fairer, more just system for his entire career. And now Marcus realized it was his turn to fight too. Over the next few weeks, Marcus worked with Chief Williams and Darren to organize a series of community meetings and workshops. They invited people from all walks of life: police officers, local residents, business owners, and even local politicians. The goal was simple: to have open conversations about race, discrimination, and the steps everyone could take to create a more just community. At first, the response was lukewarm. Some people were skeptical, unwilling to confront the hard truths that had been exposed. But as the meetings continued, as stories were shared and experiences were discussed, Marcus began to see a shift. Slowly but surely, the walls came down. People began to open up about their own experiences with bias, both in their personal lives and in their communities. They started to see each other not as us and them, but as neighbors, as people. It wasn't easy. There were difficult conversations, moments of discomfort, and plenty of pushback. But Marcus stayed committed. He knew this was just the beginning. Change wasn't going to happen overnight, but every person who attended the meetings, every person who changed their mindset, was a small victory. As the weeks turned into months, the town began to feel different. There were fewer incidents of racial bias, fewer stories of unfair treatment. People were more aware, more compassionate. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. One evening, as Marcus sat in his living room reflecting on the work he had done, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Darren. "I just wanted to say thank you," the message read. "You didn't have to do this. You didn't have to make things right, but you did. And because of you, things are different. You helped me believe that people can change, that things can get better. You're a real ally." Marcus smiled as he read the message. It was small, just a text, but it was more meaningful than any badge or award. In that moment, he knew the truth. The work wasn't about being right. It was about doing what was right. And in that, Marcus had found a new sense of purpose. As the months passed, Marcus could feel the shift in the air. The community that had once been divided by distrust and resentment was beginning to change. It wasn't an instant transformation. Change never was. But the seeds of empathy had been planted. The workshops, the conversations, and the community meetings continued, with new voices joining the cause. It wasn't just a movement anymore. It was a collective effort, one that transcended race, one that called for unity and understanding. Darren, who had once been the victim of prejudice, had become a beacon of hope. With his father's guidance, he took on a leadership role in the community. He spoke to local schools, to groups of young people, sharing his story, how he had faced discrimination, but found strength in his family, in his community, and in his ability to forgive. His words resonated deeply with many, especially with young people who had felt the weight of injustice themselves. Marcus had become a symbol of redemption. As someone who had made a mistake, had realized his own biases, and had worked to make amends, he was no longer just an officer. He was a mentor. He mentored young recruits at the police academy, teaching them not only about the technical aspects of policing, but also about the importance of empathy, integrity, and understanding the lived experiences of others. He led discussions on race, prejudice, and the importance of always striving to see beyond the uniform, beyond the color of someone's skin. But it wasn't just about teaching others. Marcus had his own journey to continue. He had become more involved in local activism, supporting programs that worked to break down barriers of race and inequality in the justice system. He worked with Chief Williams, Darren, and local organizations to push for reforms in the police department, ensuring that racial bias training was mandatory, that community relations were prioritized, and that diversity was represented at every level of law enforcement. One of the most profound changes in Marcus's life was his relationship with Darren. What started as a simple apology, followed by a reluctant but sincere understanding, had evolved into a deep and lasting friendship. Darren had forgiven Marcus, but it wasn't just about letting go of the past. It was about creating something better for the future. They both understood now that the fight wasn't over. The work they were doing together was just the beginning, and there was still much to be done. One afternoon, as Marcus and Darren walked through the newly opened community center, a place where they had both worked together to bridge divides, Darren turned to Marcus, his expression thoughtful. "You know, I used to think things would never change," Darren said, his voice quiet but firm, "that people like me would always be treated like this, like we were somehow less than everyone else. But now I see a future where people like me don't have to fight every single day just to be treated like everyone else." Marcus looked at him, feeling a deep sense of pride. It wasn't just about winning some battle. It was about the small everyday victories that made all the difference. "You helped make that future possible, Darren," Marcus said, his voice full of sincerity. "Without your strength, your father's leadership, and your courage to stand up to the hate, none of this would have happened. You've been the change we needed." Darren smiled, but there was a depth to his smile now, one that came from resilience and hope. "I couldn't have done it without you, Marcus," Darren said. "You showed me that we all have the power to change things." It's not about being perfect. It's about taking responsibility, learning, and being willing to make the hard choices. We both have our work cut out for us, but I'm glad to be in this with you." As they stood there in front of the community center, looking out at the families and children coming and going, Marcus realized just how much they had accomplished together. This wasn't just about a police officer learning a lesson. It was about a community coming together. About creating a place where empathy wasn't just a word, but a way of life. It was about making sure that Darren and so many others like him didn't have to carry the weight of prejudice on their shoulders anymore. One of the most emotional moments came when the town held its first annual Unity Day, a celebration of the progress they had made, a celebration of their shared commitment to justice and equality. Chief Williams spoke first, his words echoing through the gathered crowd. "This is a moment of pride," he said, his voice strong. "But it is also a moment of reflection. We have come a long way, but the work is never finished. We must continue to stand together as one community, with respect for one another, no matter the color of our skin, the uniform we wear, or the background we come from." The crowd cheered, and Marcus looked around at the sea of faces. Families, friends, allies. He saw Darren standing near the front, his father beside him. He saw the faces of young people who had been inspired to keep fighting for what was right. It was a moment of unity, a moment that reflected everything they had worked for, everything they had overcome. As the evening came to a close, Marcus found himself reflecting on everything that had led him to this point. He had been wrong. He had acted out of assumption, out of fear, out of bias. But now he had learned that true strength wasn't in power. It was in understanding. It was in empathy. It was in knowing that we all have a responsibility to stand up for what's right. Darren had changed his life, and Marcus had changed Darren's in the process. They had both changed their community, and that was something that no formal investigation, no bikers, no prejudice could ever take away. Months passed, and with each passing day, Marcus felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life before. His commitment to fighting for what was right, to standing up against racial prejudice, and to creating real change had never felt so strong. What had started as a moment of self-reflection triggered by a simple traffic stop had blossomed into a movement that was larger than him, larger than Darren, and even larger than the town they called home. One morning, as Marcus sipped his coffee at the kitchen table, the phone rang. It was an unknown number. He hesitated before answering, but something told him it was important. "Hello, is this Officer Marcus Jennings?" a voice on the other end asked. "Yes, this is Marcus Jennings," he replied, his voice steady. "This is Linda Harper from the State Justice Department. We've been following the work you've been doing with your community, and we're impressed by the changes you've helped implement. We'd like to invite you to speak at the state conference on law enforcement reform next month. We believe your story, your journey, could inspire others across the state." Marcus blinked, unsure he had heard the words correctly. "Wait, you want me to speak at the state conference?" he asked. "Yes, officer. We want to hear your thoughts on how to improve police-community relations and tackle systemic bias within law enforcement. Your work in your town has shown remarkable progress, and we believe other officers could benefit from hearing about your experiences." Marcus took a deep breath. This was more than just a recognition of his work. It was an opportunity to take everything he had learned and share it with the larger world. He had spent so much time in the trenches, fighting the battles at the local level, but now he realized it was time to bring those conversations to a broader stage. "I'm honored," Marcus said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I'd be happy to speak." The day of the conference arrived, and Marcus stood backstage, waiting for his turn to speak. The room was filled with law enforcement officers, activists, community leaders, and policymakers from all over the state. The anticipation was palpable, but Marcus felt a calm certainty settle over him. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all the people he had met along the way, all the lives he had touched, and all the voices that had been silenced for far too long. When his name was called, he walked onto the stage, the spotlight briefly blinding him before he adjusted to the bright lights. The room fell silent as he took the microphone. He looked out at the audience, feeling a deep sense of responsibility. "Good afternoon, everyone," Marcus began, his voice steady. "I'm here today not as a perfect officer, but as someone who has made mistakes. I've learned from those mistakes. I've learned the hard way that justice isn't just about upholding the law. It's about understanding who we're serving, who we're protecting, and how we can make the world a better place for everyone." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in. "I was a man who judged based on appearances. I acted out of instinct, out of bias, and I didn't understand the implications of my actions until I faced a situation that forced me to reckon with my own prejudices. I learned that it wasn't enough to be just an officer. I had to be a human being first. I had to see the people I served not as criminals or suspects, but as people. People with stories, with pain, with history." Marcus looked out at the crowd, his gaze steady and unwavering. "There are people like Darren Jacobs out there," he continued. "Young black men who are harassed, targeted and mistreated simply because of the color of their skin. I've seen it firsthand. I've been part of the system that failed them. But I'm also here to tell you that we can change. We must change. We have the power as officers to reshape the future. We have the power to build trust, to listen, to act with empathy, and that is what we need now." Marcus's words hung in the air, and he could see the shift in the room. Some officers nodded in agreement. Others listened with intensity. He wasn't just speaking to them as fellow officers, he was speaking to them as people who had the potential to make a difference. "I don't have all the answers," Marcus said, his voice softer now. "But what I do know is this: change starts with us. It starts with each individual officer making the choice to see their community for what it truly is, a diverse, vibrant group of people, each deserving of respect and dignity. I am proud to serve, but more than that, I am proud to stand with people like Darren, people who have shown me that strength comes in many forms, people who have shown me that fighting for justice is not just a job, it's a calling." The room remained silent for a long moment. Then slowly, the applause began, starting in small pockets before spreading throughout the room. Marcus felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. This was bigger than he had imagined. After the conference, Marcus returned home to a hero's welcome. The town, once fractured by bias and division, had become a symbol of unity and progress. Darren, who had continued to lead his own efforts to foster understanding among the youth, stood beside him. "You did it, Marcus," Darren said, his voice full of admiration. "You really got through to them." Marcus smiled, but there was a humility in his expression. "It's not about me, Darren. It's about what we've all done together. This is just the beginning. The work doesn't stop here. No, we've made a difference, but now we've got to keep pushing. The future's still waiting for us to make it better." Darren nodded, his eyes shining with pride. "And we will, together." As the two stood there, looking out over the town that had embraced change, Marcus realized that the real victory wasn't in the applause at the conference or the recognition he had received. The real victory was the impact they were having on the lives of the people around them. It was the knowledge that their efforts had rippled out into the world, creating waves of empathy, understanding, and hope. In the weeks that followed Marcus's speech at the state conference, the ripple effects of his words began to spread far beyond the borders of their small town. The community he had worked so hard to change began to see progress in ways that were tangible, and the work he and Darren had started continued to gain momentum. It wasn't just about policy change or formal training. It was about a shift in the very way people saw each other. At the local high school, where Darren had graduated just a few years earlier, a new program was implemented: Understanding Each Other. The curriculum included lessons on empathy, social justice, and the history of racial inequality. It wasn't just for the black students. It was for everyone. Every student, no matter their background, was required to attend. The goal was simple: to create an environment where conversations about race, inequality, and bias could be had openly, where students would understand the impact of their actions on the people around them. As Darren stood in front of a classroom full of students, many of whom had once been his peers, he spoke with the same courage he had shown years ago when he first met Marcus. "Each of us brings something unique to the table," Darren said, looking out at the sea of faces. But it's up to us to listen, to learn from each other. We can't keep ignoring the issues that are right in front of us, and the first step in making a difference is having the hard conversations, even when it's uncomfortable. It was a message Darren believed in deeply, and seeing the students respond with open minds and hearts was a small victory. He knew there would always be more work to do, but this felt like a sign, proof that change was happening not just in the streets, but in the hearts of the next generation. Marcus, too, was taking his newfound responsibility seriously. In addition to his work as an officer, he had become an advocate for police reform, traveling to other cities to speak at law enforcement training seminars. His story was one of redemption, but also of ongoing commitment. A commitment to make sure that the mistakes he had made and the lessons he had learned weren't forgotten. One evening, as Marcus stood in front of a crowd of law enforcement officers in a neighboring city, he shared the same message he had delivered at the state conference. "I wasn't always the officer I am today," he said, looking around the room. "I've had my own struggles, my own biases. I've made mistakes. But here's the thing. I've learned that we all have a responsibility to fight for what's right. It's not just about protecting the law. It's about protecting the people we serve. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard, even when it makes us uncomfortable." The room was quiet as the officers listened to Marcus speak. There were a few hesitant nods, a few crossed arms, but by the end of his speech, the energy had shifted. It wasn't just about his story. It was about the change that was possible when people were willing to admit their mistakes, learn from them, and take action. Back in their town, Marcus and Darren continued to work side by side, strengthening their relationship and the foundation they had built together. They became more than just allies. They became friends. They shared long conversations about the future, about the struggles they had faced and the progress they had made. Darren, who had once felt voiceless and alone, now found strength in his role as a leader. He was no longer just the victim of prejudice. He was the one paving the way for others to follow. One afternoon, as they sat in the office of the community center, Darren turned to Marcus, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You know, I never thought things would change," Darren said quietly. "I didn't think people would ever really get it. But now, when I look around and see what we've built together, I know that change is possible. And it's because of people like you, people who are willing to listen and learn." Marcus smiled, but there was a seriousness in his eyes. "It's not about me, Darren. It's about all of us. It's about people coming together, taking responsibility for the way things are, and working together to make them better. It's about what we do now that defines the future." As the two of them spoke, there was a sense of accomplishment in the air. They had done more than just make a difference. They had created a legacy. They had created a path for others to follow, a path that was built on empathy, understanding, and the unwavering belief that things could and would get better. A few months later, Marcus received an invitation from the state's highest-ranking law enforcement agency. They were offering him a position, a leadership role in a new task force dedicated to police reform. The task force's goal was to overhaul training programs, implement community-focused policies, and ensure that racial bias was addressed at every level of law enforcement. Marcus's heart raced as he read the letter. It was everything he had worked for, everything he had hoped for. But as he sat down with Sarah that evening to talk it over, he realized that the work wasn't about the title or the prestige. It was about the opportunity to continue making a real difference. It was about continuing to fight for justice, equality, and empathy, not just for him, but for everyone. "You've earned it, Marcus," Sarah said, her voice filled with pride. "But what's most important is that you continue doing what you've been doing, leading by example. You've inspired so many people, and I know you'll keep pushing for the changes that matter." Marcus smiled at her, feeling the weight of the decision, but also the clarity. This was the next step in his journey, one that would allow him to reach even more people, to make an even bigger impact. But he knew deep in his heart that his work was never done. It wasn't about achieving one goal and stopping. It was about the daily commitment to doing what was right. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Marcus continued his work on the task force, overseeing new initiatives and advocating for reform. He knew there was still so much to be done, but every victory, no matter how small, was a step in the right direction. And as he looked out at the community he had helped change, the town that had gone from fractured to united, he knew that they had made something lasting, something real. The future was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. They were no longer a community divided by fear and hate. They were a community built on understanding, respect, and the belief that a better future was possible for everyone. The town had changed in ways that Marcus couldn't have imagined when he first started down this path. What once felt like an insurmountable task, overcoming years of systemic prejudice and distrust, now felt like a shared mission. A collective goal that united people of all backgrounds in their pursuit of justice and equality. And as much as Marcus had been a part of this transformation, he knew it wasn't just his efforts. It was the community's efforts, Darren's efforts, Chief Williams's leadership, and countless others who had fought alongside them. But even in the face of progress, Marcus knew that the road ahead was still long. There would be setbacks, there would be challenges, and there would always be those who tried to pull the community backward. But for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt a sense of hope that he hadn't known before. This wasn't just about fixing one problem. It was about creating a future where people didn't have to fight every day for their dignity and respect. One chilly morning, Marcus sat down with Darren at the community center, both of them reflecting on everything they had accomplished. It had been a few months since the Unity Day celebration, and the town was slowly returning to normal, though Marcus had to admit the definition of normal had changed. Darren leaned back in his chair, looking out at the bustling community center where the after-school programs for local youth were in full swing. "It's crazy, isn't it?" he said. "I remember when we used to just talk about change, hoping that one day it would happen, and now it's happening." Marcus smiled, watching as a group of teenagers filed into a room for a leadership seminar they had organized together. "It's not crazy, Darren," Marcus replied. "It's what happens when you stop waiting for change and start being the change yourself." Darren nodded, his expression softening. "I guess you were right all along. We all have the power to make a difference, no matter how big or small. If we can just keep pushing forward, keep doing the work, we'll get there." Marcus felt a deep sense of pride, not just in the progress they had made, but in Darren. This young man who had once felt powerless, but now stood at the forefront of something larger than himself. Darren had become a leader in his own right, and Marcus knew that his example would inspire many others in the years to come. "Absolutely," Marcus agreed. "And this is just the beginning. You've got a voice now, Darren. You're shaping the future, and so is everyone else who believes in this cause." Later that week, Marcus received a call that would once again alter the course of his life. It was from the director of a prominent national non-profit organization focused on criminal justice reform. "We've been following your work, Marcus," the director said, "and we've been impressed with the tangible change you've been able to create in your community. We'd like to offer you the opportunity to join our national task force. Your experience, your leadership, it's exactly what we need to take this movement to the next level." Marcus's heart raced as he listened. It was an incredible offer, one that would allow him to influence reform on a national scale, to work with policymakers and leaders from across the country. But as the excitement bubbled up inside him, he couldn't help but think of the town, the people who had helped him grow, the community he had worked so hard to build. "I'm honored," Marcus said, his voice filled with emotion. "But I need to think this through. My heart is still here in this town. I've been a part of its transformation, and I'm not sure I'm ready to leave that behind." The director paused, understanding in his voice. "I completely understand, but we believe you could help shape policy at a national level while continuing your work locally. You don't have to leave everything behind, Marcus. This could be a way to expand your impact." Marcus sat back in his chair, contemplating the decision. It was a crossroads, one that would require him to step outside his comfort zone, to take what he had learned in his town and bring it to a much larger stage. It would mean new challenges, new responsibilities, but it also meant the opportunity to effect real change in communities far beyond his own. After hanging up the phone, Marcus sat for a while in silence, considering the options before him. His heart remained in the community with Darren and Chief Williams and all the people who had made this change possible. But he also knew that if he could help spark the same kind of transformation on a larger scale, he couldn't ignore the chance to do so. A few days later, Marcus met with Darren to discuss the offer. "You've been doing incredible work here, Marcus," Darren said, looking up from a community newsletter he had been putting together. "I think you're ready for whatever comes next." "I don't know if I'm ready to leave all of this," Marcus admitted, his voice soft with emotion. "There's still so much to do here, but I also know that the fight for justice isn't just one town, it's everywhere." Darren smiled. "I get it, but whatever you choose, you've already made a huge difference. You've changed lives, and now you can take that change to a bigger stage." Marcus looked at Darren, then around the room at the people who had become like family. "I'm not leaving it behind, Darren. Whatever happens next, we'll keep fighting the fight. We're just getting started." In the end, Marcus decided to accept the position with the national non-profit, but he made a promise to Darren, to Chief Williams, and to the people of the town. He would continue to work locally, keeping his roots in the community while expanding the scope of his work. He would be a bridge between the local and the national, using his platform to ensure that the voices of those most affected by injustice were heard loud and clear. As Marcus prepared for his next chapter, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The journey he had started, the one that had begun with a simple traffic stop, had led him to places he had never imagined. But no matter how far his work took him, he would always remember where it started, with Darren, with the people of his town, and with the belief that change was possible when people stood together. As Marcus stepped into his new role with the national non-profit organization, he couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him to this point. The work he had done in his small town, the challenges he had faced, and the transformation he had witnessed. None of it had been easy, but all of it had been worth it. He had seen the power of empathy, the strength of community, and the difference that could be made when people took responsibility for their actions and chose to fight for justice. And now he had the chance to bring that same energy, that same commitment, to a much larger scale. His first assignment with the non-profit was to help create a nationwide initiative focused on addressing racial bias within law enforcement and promoting police-community partnerships. It was exactly the kind of work Marcus had been passionate about for years, and he was determined to make it a success. But as he prepared for the rollout of the initiative, he received an unexpected phone call. It was from Darren. "Hey, Marcus, got a minute?" "Of course, Darren. What's going on?" "I wanted to let you know about something," Darren said, his voice filled with excitement. "I'm going to be joining the city council. I've been asked to run for office, and I'm really going for it. This is my chance to make an even bigger impact on our community. I think we've done so much already, but now it's time to take it to the next level." Marcus felt a surge of pride for Darren. The young man had come so far from a kid who once feared for his safety every time he stepped outside to a leader who was now stepping into the political arena. He had faced prejudice, injustice, and hatred, and yet he had found the strength to not just survive, but thrive. And now Darren was ready to take that strength into a new realm. "Darren, that's incredible," Marcus said, his voice full of admiration. "You've been leading this change since the beginning. I'm so proud of you." "I couldn't have done it without you, Marcus," Darren replied. "You've shown me what true leadership looks like. You've made me believe that change is possible. Now I want to take that belief and help others see it too." Marcus smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. Darren's growth, his transformation, was proof that change could happen. And it wasn't just about one person. It was about a community coming together, about standing up for what was right, and about building something better for future generations. Over the following months, Marcus and Darren continued to work together, even as Darren stepped into his new role on the city council. They remained committed to the same goals, pushing for reforms and fighting for justice. But now Marcus had a wider platform, one that allowed him to push for change on a national level, while Darren fought for progress in their own community. One afternoon, as Marcus and Darren sat in Marcus's office discussing the latest developments in their work, Marcus couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened since that fateful night at the gas station. "I can't believe how far we've come," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair. "It feels like just yesterday I was making the wrong call with you. I didn't understand what you were going through." Darren looked at him, a quiet strength in his eyes. "We've all got a lot to learn, Marcus, but it's never too late to start. You've shown me that." "I've learned from you too, Darren," Marcus said. "Your strength, your resilience, it's inspired me in ways I can't even put into words. You're doing more for this community than I ever could have imagined." Darren smiled, a look of determination on his face. "We're doing it together. This is about all of us, and the work isn't finished yet." Marcus nodded. He knew Darren was right. The work was never finished. There would always be more to do, more people to reach, more minds to change, more hearts to touch. But as long as they kept moving forward together, there was nothing they couldn't achieve. A year later, Marcus stood on the steps of the community centre, surrounded by his friends, colleagues, and supporters. It was a sunny afternoon, and the town had gathered to celebrate the progress they had made, the work they had done, and the future they were building together. Darren stood beside Marcus, now officially a member of the city council, his smile wide and his posture confident. Chief Williams was there too, as well as other community leaders who had joined forces to create real change. "We've come a long way," Marcus said into the microphone, his voice carrying through the crowd. "But we can't stop here. The fight for justice and equality isn't over. It's a fight we have to keep pushing for. It's about building a future where everyone, no matter the color of their skin, the background they come from, or the uniform they wear, is treated with dignity and respect." The crowd erupted into applause, and Marcus felt a swell of emotion in his chest. They had made it this far, not by force, but by the power of unity, of empathy, and of standing up for what was right. As the event continued, Marcus couldn't help but look around at the people who had helped make this happen, the people who had believed in him, in Darren, in each other. This wasn't just a victory for them. This was a victory for everyone who had ever been marginalized, every person who had been pushed aside, every voice that had been silenced. And as Darren took the stage to give his own speech, Marcus knew that their work was far from over, but for the first time, he felt confident that they were on the right path. As the years passed, Marcus's commitment to social justice and racial equality never wavered. His work on the national level continued to grow, and he became a respected voice in law enforcement reform. But it was the local impact, the everyday changes in his town, that brought him the most fulfillment. The town had become a model for what could happen when a community came together to confront its issues head-on. The once divided streets now felt united, and people from all backgrounds worked together to support one another. The town had learned to listen, to truly listen to the stories of those who had been marginalized, to acknowledge the hurt and the injustice, and to work together to make things right. Marcus, Darren, and Chief Williams had created a legacy, one built on empathy, understanding, and mutual respect. And while there was still much work to be done in the world, Marcus couldn't help but feel a quiet pride for what they had accomplished here. They had turned a moment of conflict into a turning point for their town, a spark that had ignited a flame of hope. Darren's career had flourished since his time on the city council. His leadership had extended far beyond politics. He had become a symbol of resilience, a beacon for those who felt overlooked and unheard. And now, as the youngest council member in the town's history, Darren was preparing for an even bigger role. He had been asked to run for mayor. As he sat down with Marcus one afternoon to discuss his candidacy, the weight of the conversation wasn't lost on either of them. It wasn't just about running for office. It was about continuing the work they had started, expanding the reach of the changes they had fought for. "I can't do this alone," Darren said, his eyes meeting Marcus's. "This is a community effort. We've all made this possible, I'm just taking the next step, but I know we can keep pushing, keep changing things." Marcus looked at Darren, feeling a swell of pride. The young man who had once been uncertain, who had been judged by others for no reason other than his race, was now leading the charge. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had ever felt like they didn't belong, for everyone who had ever been judged by the color of their skin, the uniform they wore, or the life they lived. "I'm proud of you, Darren," Marcus said, his voice full of emotion. "You've grown into the leader I always knew you could be. You're going to make an incredible mayor." Darren smiled, a mix of humility and determination in his expression. "We'll make this town a place where everyone feels like they belong. That's what I'm fighting for, and you've helped me get here, Marcus. You've helped me see what's possible." The night before Darren's election, Marcus stood on the steps of the community centre, looking out at the town that had become his home. The streets were quiet, but there was a sense of anticipation in the air. Tomorrow, everything could change. Darren could be the next mayor, continuing to build on the foundation they had all worked so hard to create. As Marcus turned to head inside, he saw Chief Williams walking toward him. The chief's presence was comforting, a reminder of how far they had come, how much they had accomplished. The two of them had fought side by side for justice, and now they were on the verge of seeing a dream realized. "You did good, Marcus," Chief Williams said, his voice deep and steady. "I've watched you grow, watched you lead. It's not just about being an officer, it's about being a part of something bigger. You've changed this town, and you've changed lives. I'm proud of you." Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. "We've all changed, Chief. It's not just me, it's all of us. It's the community, it's Darren, it's everyone who's been part of this." The chief nodded. "I know, and tomorrow we'll see that change continue." The next day, the election results came in, and Darren was elected mayor. The victory wasn't just his, it was the town's. It was the culmination of years of work, of conversations, of standing up to hate and prejudice. It was a victory for everyone who had ever felt like they didn't have a voice, for everyone who had been ignored or dismissed because of the color of their skin or the life they lived. As Darren gave his victory speech that evening, surrounded by his family, friends, and supporters, Marcus stood at the back of the crowd, watching with pride. The town had come so far, and Darren's election was a symbol of that progress. It was a reminder that change was possible, that no matter how entrenched the system was, people could still rise up and create a better future. "Thank you, everyone," Darren said into the microphone, his voice filled with emotion. "This isn't just my victory, this is all of ours. We fought for this, and now it's time to take the next step together. We will make this town a place where everyone is treated with respect, where justice is a right, not a privilege, where every person, no matter their background, can thrive." The crowd erupted into cheers, and Marcus couldn't help but smile. This wasn't just a victory for Darren, it was a victory for everyone who had stood up, who had fought for what was right, who had refused to let hate define them. As Marcus watched Darren take the stage, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. The work wasn't finished, and it never would be. There would always be more to fight for, more to change, more to learn. But the difference now was that they had created a legacy that would endure for generations to come. They had created a future built on understanding, empathy, and justice. And as he looked out over the crowd, over the people who had supported them, Marcus knew that the fight wasn't just his, it was everyone's. It was a fight for a future where everyone could live with dignity and respect, a fight for a future where no one had to fear judgment because of who they were or what they looked like. It was a fight that was worth every moment.